The world watched in disbelief. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of Europe and beyond. People were stunned, unable to comprehend the gravity of what had just occurred. On a sunny morning in Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. He was accompanied by his wife, Sophie, as they rode through the streets in an open car, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. It happened on June 28, 1914. The date would be etched into history as the moment the world changed forever. A young Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, fired the fatal shots. Princip, a member of the Black Hand, a secret society committed to Serbian nationalism, had been waiting for this moment. This act, seemingly isolated, ignited a powder keg of tensions in Europe. The continent had been a tinderbox, with various nations harbouring deep-seated grievances and ambitions. For years, Europe's great powers had engaged in a dangerous game. They manoeuvred for power and influence, each trying to outdo the other in a complex web of diplomacy and military posturing. Nationalism and imperialism fueled their ambitions. Countries sought to expand their empires and assert their dominance, often at the expense of their neighbours. They built up their armies and formed alliances. These alliances were meant to provide security, but they also created a sense of inevitability about the coming conflict. These alliances were meant to deter conflict. However, they also meant that any local dispute had the potential to escalate into a much larger war. Instead, they created a system where a single spark could ignite a global conflagration. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was that spark, setting off a chain reaction that would engulf the world. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was that spark. The immediate aftermath saw shock and mourning, but it quickly turned to anger and calls for action. Austria-Hungary, outraged and fueled by decades of simmering tensions with Serbia, saw an opportunity for retribution. The assassination provided the pretext they had been waiting for. They issued an ultimatum to Serbia, filled with demands designed to be rejected. The terms were harsh and uncompromising, leaving little room for negotiation. Serbia, backed by Russia, refused to fully comply. The fragile peace unraveled. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic nations, began to mobilize its forces in support of Serbia. Within weeks, the intricate web of alliances came into play. Countries that had pledged to support each other were now being drawn into the conflict one by one. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. The declaration set off a domino effect, with other nations quickly following suit. Russia, bound by treaty to protect Serbia, mobilized its troops. The mobilization was seen as a direct threat by Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, viewed Russia's mobilization as a threat and declared war on Russia on August 1st. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally. The conflict was no longer confined to the Balkans, it was spreading across Europe. World War I had begun. The world would never be the same again as nations were drawn into a brutal and devastating conflict that would reshape the course of history. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not the sole cause of World War I. It was, however, the spark that ignited a long-standing powder keg of political and military tensions that had been building up for decades. It was the catalyst that exposed the deep-seated tensions and rivalries within Europe. These tensions were the result of a complex web of alliances, nationalistic fervour, and imperial ambitions that had been simmering beneath the surface. The continent was a tinderbox, and the assassination was the match that set it ablaze. The intricate network of alliances meant that any conflict had the potential to draw in multiple nations, turning a regional dispute into a full-scale war. For decades, Europe's great powers had been divided into two armed camps. These camps were not just military alliances, but also political and economic partnerships that bound the nations together in a fragile balance of power. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This alliance was primarily defensive, aimed at countering the perceived threat from other European powers. The Triple Entente, a counter-alliance, emerged in 1907 comprising France, Russia and Great Britain. This alliance was a response to the growing power of the Triple Alliance and was intended to create a balance of power in Europe. These alliances, intended to deter aggression, instead created a climate of suspicion and fear. Each nation was wary of the others, and the alliances only served to heighten the sense of impending conflict. Each nation felt compelled to support its allies, regardless of the circumstances. This sense of obligation meant that any conflict involving one member of an alliance could quickly draw in the others, escalating the situation. This system of rigid alliances meant that a conflict between two nations could quickly escalate into a continental war. The alliances created a domino effect, where the involvement of one nation led to the involvement of others. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, it triggered a chain reaction. The declaration was not just a bilateral conflict, but a signal to the entire alliance system to prepare for war. Russia, obligated to defend Serbia, mobilized its troops. This mobilization was seen as a direct threat by Germany, which had its own alliances and military plans to consider. This mobilization, seen as a threat by Germany, prompted Germany's declaration of war on Russia. Germany's strategic plans required a swift and decisive action to neutralize the threat from the east. Germany's war plans, relying on a swift victory in the west before turning their attention eastward, required them to attack France, Russia's ally. This was part of the infamous Schlieffen Plan, which aimed to avoid a prolonged two-front war. The dominoes continued to fall. As each nation honored its alliance commitments, the conflict expanded, drawing in countries from across Europe and eventually the world. The web of alliances meant to preserve peace had instead woven the fabric of war. At the outset of World War I, there was a widespread belief that the conflict would be short and decisive. Military strategists on all sides adhered to the principles of 19th century warfare. They believed in rapid mobilization, decisive battles, and a swift victory. This illusion of a quick victory was shattered in the trenches. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, designed to knock France out of the war quickly by outflanking their defences, ran into fierce resistance. The Battle of Marne in September 1914 halted the German advance. The war on the Western Front settled into a bloody stalemate. The initial stages of the war were marked by mobile warfare. Armies clashed on open battlefields. Cavalry units still charged across the fields, a vestige of a bygone era. However, this traditional form of warfare quickly proved ineffective against the devastating firepower of modern weaponry. Machine guns, artillery and poison gas transformed the battlefields into landscapes of death and destruction. Section 4. The stalemate of trench warfare. As the war on the Western Front dragged on, a new and brutal form of warfare emerged: trench warfare. This method of fighting defined much of World War I, creating a static and grueling battlefield where progress was measured in mere yards. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, a complex network of trenches, dugouts and barbed wire entanglements stretched for hundreds of miles. These trenches were meticulously constructed, with frontline, support and reserve trenches forming a formidable defensive system. Soldiers on both sides faced unimaginable conditions. The trenches were often waterlogged, leading to trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and unsanitary conditions. Life in the trenches was a horrific ordeal. Soldiers lived in constant fear of enemy attacks, and the lack of proper sanitation led to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery and cholera. Soldiers endured constant shelling, machine gun fire, and the ever-present threat of sniper attacks. The noise and chaos of battle were relentless, making rest and recovery nearly impossible. Disease was rampant, and the psychological toll of prolonged combat was immense. Many soldiers suffered from what was then known as shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The trenches became a muddy, rat-infested hell on earth. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on human remains and spreading disease, adding to the soldiers' misery. Offensives on the Western Front typically involved massive artillery bombardments followed by infantry charges across no man's land, the desolate strip of land between the trenches. This area was often littered with barbed wire and landmines, making any advance perilous. These offensives often resulted in staggering casualties for minimal territorial gains. The High Command's strategy of attrition led to a war of exhaustion, with both sides suffering immense losses. The Battle of the Somme, which lasted from July to November 1916, epitomized the futility of trench warfare. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. Over 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded, and the front line moved only a few miles. The staggering loss of life and the minimal territorial gains highlighted the brutal and senseless nature of trench warfare, a grim testament to the horrors of World War I. Section 5. A global battlefield. World War I was not confined to the battlefields of Europe. It was a truly global conflict, with fighting raging in Africa, the Middle East and Asia. European colonial powers drew their colonies into the war, transforming the conflict into a struggle for global dominance. In Africa, British, French and German colonial forces clashed in a series of campaigns. These campaigns often involved local populations who were forced to fight on behalf of their colonial masters. The war in Africa disrupted trade, devastated economies, and left a legacy of bitterness and resentment. The Middle East also became a major theatre of war. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, controlled strategically important territories in the region, including access to the Suez Canal. British and Arab forces fought to wrest control of these territories from the Ottomans. The Arab Revolt, led by T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, played a significant role in undermining Ottoman control of the region.